The Battle of Kings Mountain. Prologue. In the autumn of 1780, the Carolina backcountry stood on edge. Major Patrick Ferguson of the British Army had sent word across the Blue Ridge that if the mountain settlers did not swear loyalty to the king, he would march over the ridges, hang their leaders, and burn their farms. It was a threat meant to break their spirit. Instead, it united them. From scattered cabins and frontier valleys, local militias rode out under their own colonels: Campbell, Shelby, Sevier, Cleveland, Brandon, and Williams, men who answered to no Congress and waited for no orders. Their march against Ferguson was not commanded from Philadelphia, but born in the hearts of free settlers who refused to be ruled by fear. They came from beyond the mountains, carrying long rifles and faith alone, to fight an enemy trained and disciplined, encamped on a rocky ridge called Kings Mountain. This story, of defiance, courage, and the turning of the Southern War, is inspired by the first-hand account of Major Thomas Young, who was but 15 years old when he climbed that mountain barefoot and helped shape the destiny of a nation. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Frontier. I was born upon the edge of wilderness and empire, where the line between civilization and freedom was drawn not with ink, but with musket and axe. My people had crossed the mountains westward before I was old enough to hold a rifle, and in doing so, had broken the king's decree. His Majesty had ordered that none should pass the Blue Ridge, that the Indian nations might be left in peace and the settlers kept beneath the shadow of royal control. Yet the mountains did not care for decrees, and neither did the men who crossed over them to tame the land. They were of hard stock, Scots-Irish, German, and English, who had come down the valleys of Virginia and followed the rivers to their sources, and when they could go no farther south, they went west. The air beyond the ridge was sharp and clean. The soil was rich and dark. A man who could build his own cabin, plant his corn, and defend his hearth from wolf or savage could claim his portion of the earth. The king called it disobedience. We called it life. In those years, I was but a boy of 15, small of frame but eager to prove myself among men. My brother John had already given his life at Brandon's defeat, cut down in the thick of a hopeless fight against Loyalist horsemen. His death made a soldier of me before I had even worn a uniform. My mother wept, but she did not forbid me. She had the stern faith of the Brandons, and when she prayed, she did so with her jaw set. We heard that a British officer named Major Patrick Ferguson had taken command of the Western Loyalists, fellow colonists who chose to remain loyal to the crown. Choosing sides was not easy, but we all faced that decision. Ferguson was a soldier of experience and courage, but he made the mistake of threatening men who did not frighten easily. The words crossed the wilderness like a spark in dry grass. The men of Watauga, Holston, and the valleys beyond gathered in council. They were farmers, hunters, and blacksmiths, yet they spoke like patriots. If Ferguson means to come over the mountains, they said, then we will save him the trouble and go to him first. No general gave them the order. No paymaster promised them bounty. They fought because they believed the soil they had cleared with their hands was theirs by right, and no distant king should command them. So it was that in the last days of September, we gathered at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. The campfires flickered along the banks like stars fallen upon the earth. Men stood silent as their ministers prayed over them, asking God to bless a cause that seemed desperate but just. Each man brought his own horse, his own rifle, his own courage. They swore not to rest until Ferguson was driven from Carolina or laid in the ground. I remember that moment. It was as if history itself was watching. We were few, untrained, and ill-supplied, yet there was a power among us that no king could muster. It was the power of men who had tasted liberty, and once having done so, would not yield it again. When we descended the eastern slope, the leaves of the hickories were already turning. The rains came hard, the rivers ran high. We rode with our rifles wrapped in deerskin and our powder tied close to the body to keep it dry. At night we slept upon the wet ground, the sound of thunder rolling through the hollows like cannon fire, yet none complained. There was something in the air that told us we were part of more than a foray of frontier men. We were the hinge upon which a war might turn. Let me tell you about powder and bullets. I have fought beside many brave men, but I tell you plain, without the work of the women behind us, there would have been no shots fired at Kings Mountain, no battle won. While we carried our rifles and risked the sword, they waged their own quiet war at home, with kettles, shovels, and fire. Gunpowder was the lifeblood of the Revolution, and it did not come from armories alone. Women like Mary McKeon Patton of the Watauga country turned their homes into workshops of war. They gathered saltpeter from barn floors and caves, leached it through ashes to draw the nitrate, burned soft wood for charcoal, and mixed it all with sulfur in careful measure. The faintest mistake could cost them their lives, yet they worked by lamplight, grinding and drying that black powder until it was fit for the rifles we carried into battle. It was said that Mistress Patton herself made over £500 for the men who rode over the mountains to fight Ferguson, and when the powder was ready, they made bullets too, melting pewter plates, lead pipes, even window weights, and pouring the metal into small iron molds. These were not idle helpmates of war, but its unseen engineers. The smoke that hung over King's Mountain rose first from their furnaces and their courage. Many a man who took aim that day owed his shot to a woman who never left her cabin, and I will remember that as long as I live. I was only a boy then, but I felt older each mile we rode. I had left behind my mother's cabin, my brother's grave, and the safe ignorance of youth. Before me lay a name, King's Mountain, that I had not yet heard, but toward which I was already riding, barefoot into history. Chapter 2. Riders of the Storm. The first frost came early that autumn, silvering the high grass along the ridges where the wind never stopped. We rode eastward through rain and thunder, following the narrow traces that wound down the Blue Ridge. The passes were deep and the air thin. Water ran off the slopes in torrents, and the rocks were slick beneath the horses' hooves. Yet no man turned back. The thought of Ferguson's threat rode with us, a darker storm than the clouds above our heads. We were a strange company, Virginians, Carolinians, and mountain men from the far western valleys, each wearing what he owned, each bound by oath alone. Some had hunting shirts of homespun, others wore coats taken from old campaigns. There were boys scarcely older than I, and gray-bearded men who had fought the Cherokee when I was still in my mother's arms. We had no uniforms, no drums, no wagons. What we had were long rifles, the best in the colonies, and hearts that did not know how to yield. The path brought us into the low country, and with it came news. Ferguson was retreating northward, trying to reach Cornwallis at Charlotte. His army was made almost entirely of Loyalist militia, Carolinians who had sworn to the king but feared the wrath of their neighbors. They had been brave enough in pursuit, but now the mountains were behind them, and the woods alive with the very men they had threatened to destroy. Their commander, Major Patrick Ferguson, was already a name spoken with respect even by his enemies. He was a Scotsman, educated, proud, and famously the finest marksman in the British Army. Years before, he had astonished his peers by inventing a new breech-loading rifle of his own design, a weapon so quick and precise that a skilled man could fire 6 shots a minute. None of those rifles had reached his Loyalist here. The king's army still fought with the old muskets. Yet Ferguson's genius with arms and his confidence in his skill gave him a legend that marched ahead of him, like the whistle he carried at his breast. Ferguson's silver whistle, once a proud sound of command, had become the call of a hunted man. At the cowpens we halted, meeting others who had come down from the east, men under Colonel James Williams, Thomas Brandon, Benjamin Cleveland, and Isaac Shelby. They were killing beeves when we arrived, and the smell of fresh meat drifted through the camp like a promise. We had eaten nothing but parched corn for days. When they shared their beef with us, I thought it the finest meal I had ever tasted. The camp buzzed with quiet talk. Ferguson was close, perhaps a day's march ahead, moving with 1,000 Loyalists and a few women who followed his camp. One was said to be a loyal widow from the Catawba country. Another, younger, had ridden with him since the summer. Such details mattered to the men. They made Ferguson human, and that made him mortal. That night the rain fell hard again. We lay in the open fields, our rifles wrapped tight, our blankets drawn over our heads. Lightning split the sky, showing faces slick with water and resolve. In the dark, a man could hear the river swelling and the horses stamping nervously in the mud. Yet there was comfort in that misery, for every drop of rain that fell on us fell also on Ferguson's men, and we believed Providence was leveling the field. By dawn, we were in the saddle again, riding toward the broad river. The fords were swollen, and the current tugged at the horses' legs like hands trying to drag us under. We crossed a Cherokee ford, the cold water biting at our skin, and found no enemy on the far side. Still, the signs were fresh: hoofprints, ashes, and the smell of burnt wood. Somewhere ahead, Ferguson was on the move. By midday, the rain eased. We came upon a meeting house, its roof half torn away, the ground strewn with chestnut burrs. The trees around it had been cut down. The Loyalists had felled them for their nuts, leaving stumps like broken teeth in the red clay. Beyond that, the land rose gently toward a ridge where rumor said the enemy had halted. A courier named George Watkins, a Whig who had been taken and paroled by the British, met our officers on the road. His clothes were still wet from the rain, and his voice shook when he spoke. "You're near him now," he said. "Half a mile, maybe less. Ferguson's on a high hill they call King's Mountain. He thinks himself safe up there." The order came quick and calm. "Tie your blankets, pick and prime your guns, and be ready." No one spoke after that. The officers gathered under a dripping oak, and I watched as they chose a commander. There was no general among us, only colonels, proud men all, but practical in the moment. They gave command to Colonel William Campbell of Virginia, a man broad of chest and plain of speech. "Gentlemen," he said, "each of you knows his duty. We'll attack from every side. Let every man take care of himself and rely on his rifle." We moved forward in silence, our boots sinking in the wet clay. The rain had stopped, but the air hung heavy and close. I could smell smoke from the Loyalist camp drifting down the ridge. Somewhere ahead they were drying their powder and laughing at the thought that a band of farmers would dare to fight them. We slept little that night. I lay beside Joseph Williams, the young son of Colonel Williams, and listened to the low murmur of men tightening flints, checking powder, and whispering prayers. My musket was loaded, the priming fresh. The sky was clear now, the stars bright through the black limbs of the trees. In the stillness I felt the weight of what was coming, not fear, but a strange calm, as if time itself were pausing to take a breath. Somewhere on that dark ridge above us Ferguson slept, believing no power on earth could drive him from his mountain. We were determined to prove him wrong. Chapter 3. The Ring Around the Mountain. The morning of October 7th broke gray and cool, with mist coiling among the trees like smoke from unseen fires. Dew hung on the leaves, and every man's breath rose pale in the damp air. There was no bugle, no drum, no sound but the creak of leather and the quiet click of men checking their flints. When the word passed down the line to move, it was no louder than a whisper, but it ran through the ranks like a spark through dry grass. We were perhaps 900 in all, moving in small columns through the woods. Colonel William Campbell, now in command, divided us into 4 bodies to strike from every side. As the plan went, Shelby and Sevier took one flank, Cleveland and Williams the other, with Brandon's Carolinians among them. The ground rose ahead of us, a long narrow ridge, wooded thick with chestnut and oak, the soil red and slick from rain. On that ridge waited Major Patrick Ferguson and about 1,000 Loyalists, mostly Carolinians like ourselves, wearing coats of brown or blue and fighting for a cause opposite to ours, but not foreign in blood. We were ordered to tie our blankets behind us, to carry nothing that might hinder us in the climb. Each man made ready in his own manner, a last prayer, a word to his neighbor, the tightening of a belt. I remember thinking that I was 15 years old and barefoot, but that my feet no longer felt the cold. When the first shot cracked from the far end of the ridge, the rest of us answered it with a shout that rolled around the mountain like thunder. Then came another volley, and another. The ridge seemed to awaken in fury. Smoke gathered in sheets, hanging in the damp air and hiding everything beyond a few yards. I ran forward with the rest, the ground slippery beneath me, the musket heavy in my hands. Ahead, Loyalists fired down the slope, their bayonets flashing in the light that filtered through the leaves. They were brave men, and they fought well. Ferguson had trained them to charge with the bayonet, knowing our rifles were too slow to load at close range. When they came down upon us, the forest echoed with their shouts. We fell back a few paces, loaded behind trees, and rose again to fire. It was the rhythm of that battle. Advance, fire, fall back, reload, advance again. There was no order, no line, only the will of each man and the sound of his comrades shouting in the smoke. Near me was Ben Hollingsworth, a neighbor's son. We found cover behind a chestnut tree whose bark soon flew in splinters under enemy fire. "It won't do here, Tom," he said. "We shall be killed." I could scarcely see him for the smoke. Bark and splinters stung my face. We moved to a hollow where the ground rose gently, and there we loaded in crouch and fired standing. Each shot fell true. The enemy's line wavered. Ferguson rode up and down the ridge on a white horse, blowing a silver whistle to rally his men. Through breaks in the smoke I saw him once, his plaid shirt making him stand out, his sword lifted high. He rode as if immortal, calling to his troops, cursing them to stand firm. His voice carried over the din, fierce and proud. In that moment I felt a grudging respect for him. He fought as a soldier should. The battle climbed the ridge by degrees, as if the mountain itself were alive and angry. We closed the circle tighter with every volley. From where I crouched, I could see flashes of movement on every side. Our men advancing, shouting, pressing upward through the smoke. The Loyalists could no longer tell where the next fire came from. They turned this way and that, firing into shadows, their powder growing damp, their ranks shrinking. Then word passed down that Colonel Williams had fallen, shot through the body. I ran toward the sound of his name and found him lying near a tent, his son Daniel bending over him. Someone had brought water to wash the blood from his face. His lips moved, and I heard the words clear through the noise. "For God's sake, boys, don't give up the hill." Those words burned into me like powder flame. The fight seemed to surge anew after that. We pressed harder, our shouts louder, and the ring around the mountain tightened. From above came the sharp blast of Ferguson's whistle, that proud signal we had heard all through the fight, and every rifle on the ridge turned toward the sound. The Overmountain Men had not forgotten his threats to burn their homes and hang their kin. They meant to make him pay for every word. Shots cracked from every side. One struck his arm, another his chest, then another. Still he tried to rally his men, shouting and wheeling his horse through the smoke. Then the animal reared, struck again by wild fire, and Ferguson tumbled backward, one foot caught in the stirrup. The horse bolted down the slope, dragging him through brush and rock until both went down together. When the shooting stopped, someone shouted what we already knew. Ferguson was dead. A few minutes later, the firing slackened. White cloths waved above the smoke. The Loyalists were surrendering. The battle that had begun in a roar ended in an uncanny stillness, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of musket wadding burning in the leaves. I stood upon the ridge, my musket blackened, my hands trembling from exhaustion. Around me men cheered or fell to their knees in prayer. I looked down at my bare feet, cut and bleeding from the climb over stone and briar. I had gone into battle without shoes and came out the same, my feet torn but my spirit unshaken. I felt no pain, only the heavy stillness that follows when fear and fury have spent themselves. We had climbed the mountain and broken the enemy in a single hour. Ferguson lay dead among his men. His 2 camp women were found, one killed in the crossfire, the other alive but shaken, said later to have known him by the plaid cloak he wore. The smoke drifted away, and sunlight broke through the trees. The air smelled of wet powder and chestnut leaves. It was done. The hill that God himself could not take, as Ferguson had boasted, had fallen to barefoot farmers and riflemen. I remember thinking then, though I could not yet understand its meaning, that this ridge, red with clay and courage, would change the course of the war. But at that moment I only wished for water, rest, and to see the sun rise again. Chapter 4. The Hill and Its Reckoning. Evening came to King's Mountain with a hush like the stillness after thunder. Smoke drifted low through the trees, blue and thin, and the cries of the wounded faded into silence. The ridge that had roared with musket fire now lay quiet, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. We moved among the fallen, patriot and loyalist alike. No one cheered. Men spoke softly, stepping around the bodies as though treading on holy ground. The air was heavy with powder and rain. Near the summit lay Major Patrick Ferguson, half buried under his horse. His whistle was still at his breast. The woman who survived his camp knelt beside him, sobbing that she knew him by his shirt. The other lay dead not far off, struck in the chaos. Colonel Campbell ordered Ferguson buried where he fell. We piled stones until a cairn stood firm above him. No speech was made. Someone only said, "He was brave." We tended the wounded with what little we had. Shirts torn into bandages, canteens passed hand to hand. The prisoners sat apart, some praying, others staring blankly. Many were boys, no older than I had been when the war found me. They had fought for their king as we fought for our homes. Looking on them, victory felt cold. By dawn, the question of justice arose. Among the captured were men accused of murdering patriots, raiders who had hanged farmers and burned cabins. The anger among our ranks was deep and old, and a few were determined to settle it then and there. They called themselves judges, but grief and fury were their law. Some officers tried to stop them, others turned away. When it ended, 9 men swung from the trees. It was a hard sight, vengeance wearing the face of righteousness. I understood their rage, but I could not take pride in it. War changes the meaning of mercy until even compassion feels like betrayal. Rain came again that night, steady and cold. It washed the blood from the slope and hissed upon our dying fires. We lay among the pines too weary for talk. Some prayed, some wept quietly, and others stared into the flames, seeing faces that would never come home. At first light we began the march northward, driving the prisoners before us through the Blue Ridge passes. Most of us were barefoot, our clothes in tatters, our bellies empty. Yet we shared what we had. The Loyalists were beaten men now, not enemies, only survivors like ourselves. As we climbed through fog and rain, I looked back once and saw the ridge of King's Mountain fading into the mist. I knew I would never forget it, not for the battle itself, but for what followed, courage, cruelty, and the uneasy peace between them. When we reached the settlements, people called us heroes. They said King's Mountain had turned the war, and they were right. Cornwallis pulled back toward the coast, and within months came Cowpens, where we struck Tarleton's Dragoons, and later Guilford Courthouse, Eutaw Springs, and finally Yorktown, where the King's flag came down. But the first break in Britain's chain was forged on that ridge, by farmers and frontiersmen who answered no orders but their own. I was 15 then, barefoot and raw from the climb. Now, an old man, I still hear that mountain when the wind moves through the trees. I have walked the place again, the slope green now, the stones gray with age. Ferguson lies where we left him, and the ridge is quiet. Yet beneath the soil I can still feel the heartbeat of that day, fear, fury, and faith bound together. I remember Colonel Williams's last words, "For God's sake, boys, don't give up the hill." We did not give it up. But I have often wondered what part of ourselves we left upon it. We learned that freedom is not secured in a single fight. It must be guarded by each generation in its own way. We were rough men, untrained and half-starved, but we proved that liberty need not wait for kings or congresses to bestow it. It can be won by common hands with the will to stand firm. If the spirit that carried us up that mountain ever fades, then let those who come after us climb it again. Look upon the quiet stones, and remember what it cost to keep a hill and a country free.